Hello, this is Mrs. Johnson, and today we're going to start talking about natural selection. Now, this is our introduction to the evolution chapter, and evolution is one of the most controversial things that we'll study in biology. Now, no matter what you believe, whether you agree with evolution or you do not, it's an important topic to learn. Even if you don't agree that evolution occurred, you do need to understand this so that if you do argue the idea of evolution with someone, you know what you're talking about and you can argue it intelligently. Evolution also is a very central topic in biology, so understanding the theory of evolution will help you to understand a lot of other concepts and how they are tied together. And so we'll be taking a look at that. We're starting out by looking at natural selection. We'll better understand what this topic states, but also natural selection is not controversial. And we'll talk about how this component of evolution is accepted and why there is not argument over whether natural selection occurs or not. Now let's start relatively at the beginning. Charles Darwin is always associated with the theory of natural selection. He's the one who developed this theory. So in 1831, Darwin traveled to South America on the ship HMS Beagle. He was the naturalist. Now, a lot of people assume that Darwin went on this trip in order to prove this theory of evolution, and this is not true. Darwin actually started out as a theologian. He studied in seminary. And he was offered this opportunity to travel aboard the HMS Beagle. He was offered this job as a naturalist, and he jumped at the opportunity. Wouldn't you? Such an exciting adventure. And so his job was to collect species, and where he found the majority of the species that led him to this discovery was around Ecuador in the Galapagos Islands. So he collected a large number of species there that were unlike species anywhere else. So when Darwin returned to England, he took these specimens to the British Museum and worked with a taxonomist. Taxonomist is someone who classifies organisms, and he attempted to identify and classify these species. Now, Darwin believed that he had a whole bunch of different species of birds. So looking at these, he saw all of these different birds. And what the taxonomist realized was these were all different types of finches. So they're all very similar with slight differences. They're the same type of bird. His hypothesis was that these finches must have somehow blown over to to the Galapagos from the mainland. And as they lived in these different environments, birds with different beak sizes survived better in different environments. And he especially saw in areas where there was drought and all of the seeds that were available were hard and dried out, birds that had much larger, stronger beaks were more prevalent. In areas where there was much more rain, and so there were a lot more softer seeds available, tiny seeds, then birds with smaller beaks were able to survive better. And so he realized that birds were able to survive better based on the better adaptations they had that best fit and best matched their environment. So using this information, Darwin developed the theory of natural selection. Those with the best traits had the best chance of survival, in other words, survival of the fittest. But he was very hesitant to publish this theory. He knew it was extremely controversial. He wasn't the first person to suggest the idea of evolution. This had been suggested before. In fact, his grandfather had published a book about the theory of evolution. Darwin was the first person to suggest a plausible method for how evolution occurs. So natural selection was an explanation of how evolution occurs. And he was the first person to suggest this theory. But he also knew that anyone who discussed the theory of evolution was not well received. His grandfather had a horrible time after this. This ruined his career. And so this led him to be very hesitant. Now, what pushed him to publish was the fact that another man, Alfred Russel Wallace, came up with a similar theory at the same time. Now, think about it this way. If Alfred Russel Wallace publishes first, and then Darwin does, it looks like Darwin is copying Wallace. So if Wallace publishes first, Darwin loses out on his credit. So what Darwin did was him and Alfred Russel Wallace decided to publish together. Now the reason that you never hear of Alfred Russel Wallace, even though he worked with Darwin and published this together, is because Darwin continued to publish afterwards. Alfred Russel Wallace didn't really publish very much after the theory of natural selection was published. So let's take a look at what the theory of natural selection states. First, we have to look at the word adaptation. Now, adaptation is a term that students can get confused a lot because we tend to use this in our daily lives in a non-scientific context. And so let's look at what adaptation means and then distinguish between adaptation in terms of evolution and adaptation in our daily lives so that we can make sure we use this term correctly. Adaptation is a beneficial trait. Let me say that again, a beneficial trait that allows an individual to survive better than others. So that adaptation helps individuals compete for food or other resources or avoid predators. That's how this beneficial trait can help you to survive better. Not getting eaten or making sure you get enough food, that better trait helps you survive better. Now, those individuals that have that adaptation, that better trait, are then able to have more offspring. Think about it this way. If a certain species lifespan is, let's say, 15 years, and one individual is best able to avoid getting eaten, gets all the food, plenty of resources, it's not starving, it lives that full 15 years, it's got plenty of time to have offspring. But another individual of that species doesn't have that beneficial trait. It can only live 5 years. It doesn't have as much time to leave offspring. If it's starving, it also doesn't have the spare resources to dedicate to having offspring. It's just going to try to survive. And so those with the best traits can have more offspring. And if these traits are hereditary, then the offspring would also have these traits. If the trait is in the DNA, it can pass those on. And so if this is a trait that's just developed over time, it's not hereditary, it's not in your genes, and therefore it can't be passed down to the offspring. And so here especially is where we distinguish between adaptations in our daily lives and adaptations in the terms of evolution. So for example, a daily life situation. I moved to Colorado to this higher elevation. I had to adapt to being able to breathe with this lower oxygen level. That is not a change in my DNA, and so therefore that is not considered an adaptation. That's not a beneficial trait that I will pass down to my offspring. My favorite example to give to my students, and I wish you could see me here, but I don't want to try to put a video and block all of your information, but I always tell my students, I'm going to get super buff. I'm going to get super strong. Will I pass that trait on to my offspring? The answer is no. Changing my traits, changing my muscles, building up, being stronger, that's not a hereditary trait. I haven't changed my DNA. I'm not going to pass it down to my offspring. Changing your hair color, changing other aspects about yourself. Anything you can change about yourself personally, you're not changing your DNA. Therefore, it's not an adaptation. So, adaptations are those beneficial traits that you happen to be born with. If you happen to get that trait, awesome, you luck out, you've got a better chance of survival. If you were born without the DNA for that beneficial trait, bummer, you don't have that adaptation, that benefit. So, those individuals with that trait live longer, have more offspring, pass on that trait to the offspring, so therefore in the next generation there will be more individuals with that beneficial trait. So let me reiterate this to make sure everybody's comfortable with this concept of adaptation. An adaptation is any trait that is beneficial and is hereditary. It's in your DNA. You can pass it down to your offspring. So things like dyeing your hair, developing big muscles from working out and being super buff, any of those things that I can change are not evolutionary adaptations. So therefore, an individual cannot adapt. An individual may be born with an adaptation. They cannot adapt. You cannot change your DNA to develop a beneficial trait that you can pass on to your offspring. I hope that that was explained clearly. So now this next slide is just for your benefit. I get a lot of students who say, okay, so what is the definition of natural selection? So this slide might seem redundant, but this is a nice, coherent definition of natural selection for you. Individuals with better adaptations have a better chance of survival and therefore are able to produce more offspring. Therefore, future generations will have more individuals with that trait. I will encourage you put a star next to that, highlight that, circle it, whatever you need to do. That is your nice, concise definition of natural selection. The next section we're going to get into are the 5 principles of natural selection. Now you'll notice this slide is in blue and italics because I don't want you stressing about writing all of these yet. We're going to get into each one of these. But just to introduce the 5 principles, these 5 things have to be present in the environment in order for natural selection to occur. If any of these are missing, then natural selection won't occur. And what I want you thinking about as we look at this, I get a lot of students who ask, so is natural selection happening in human populations? And the answer is no, not really, because we have removed some of these principles from human populations, and you'll see that as we get to these. And as I just said, if any of these principles are not present, natural selection will not occur. Go ahead and put a star next to that. So our first principle is variation. There must be variation. There must be difference in the population in order for natural selection to occur. If everybody has the exact same traits, there's no better, there's no worse, everybody's the same. And so what I normally say when we're in a classroom, this doesn't work as well when you're stuck at home and you can only see your family members around you, but I want you to picture your classmates. When I tell you look around the classroom, you look around and you see that there's all kinds of differences in our classroom, but I want you to think about how much variation is there in the number of arms? There's none. Everybody has 2 arms. Everybody has 2 legs. Everybody has 0 wings. There is no variation in those traits, and so therefore nobody has a better trait than another, and so therefore no natural selection will occur in those traits. Now keep in mind, a trait must exist in the population already in order for individuals to receive it. It won't just appear because it's helpful. New random traits that occur due to mutations are random. And so an example that would seem kind of timely, it'd be really helpful if people had an immunity to COVID. But if that trait doesn't already exist in the population, the chance of somebody just randomly developing that mutation, because it would be a helpful mutation to have, is extremely rare. We're talking 1 in millions or billions or trillions. And so the fact that a trait would be beneficial doesn't mean it will show up. If that mutation does happen to occur, and it does happen to be beneficial, it will stick around. That will be passed on to more offspring. But if a trait occurs, a random mutation, and that random mutation is harmful, which more often than not, random mutations are harmful, we've talked about those a lot, then that organism has a worse chance of surviving, less likely to be able to live long enough to have offspring, and less likely to pass down that harmful trait to the next generation. Second principle of natural selection is heritability. The trait must be heritable. It must be on the DNA. If it's not on the DNA, it won't be passed down. Natural selection cannot act on that trait. The third principle of natural selection is there's a struggle for survival. There are limited resources, there are predators, there are harsh conditions. All of these things make survival difficult. If you have an adaptation, a beneficial trait that helps you better survive those conditions, you're able to better compete for resources. You're able to hide from predators, avoid getting eaten. You're able to stay warm enough when it's cold outside, or if you live in an environment where it's hot, you're able to stay cool. If you have a trait that helps you better survive that struggle, those harsh conditions, then you're more likely to survive than others. Here in this example, these are peppered moths, and this is an example that is used a lot in evolution. It's a sound logical principle, but unfortunately the experiment was not carried out accurately. But what you can see here, this peppered moth is dark, so it blends in. That is an adaptation that helps it to avoid predators. This peppered moth is light, and so on this dark tree, this peppered moth is not going to survive. On a lighter colored tree, this light colored peppered moth is much more likely to blend in, and the dark peppered moth sticks out like a sore thumb. And so the principle here, camouflage as an adaptation, is sound, but realize that the peppered moth experiment is flawed. Now, struggle for survival. Let's apply this to the human population because, again, I get this question a lot. Does natural selection happen in the human population? We have really removed the struggle for survival. At least in this country we have limited resources. Maybe not right now, but generally you can go to the grocery store and get whatever food or anything you need. Predators, we're at the top of the food chain. We don't have animals that are trying to eat us in harsh conditions. If it's 110 degrees outside, if you lived in Phoenix like I did, go inside with the air conditioning. If it's snowing and there's 3 feet of snow outside, go inside with a heater. We have done so many things to limit this struggle so that humans do not have better traits than others. In fact, when we talked about harmful mutations in the last slide, we have even taken away those types of struggles. In nature, a bird that has a broken wing or a broken leg probably is not going to survive because it can't compete for food. But in the human population, we're not going to let someone just die just because they have a broken leg or because they have some other harm. And so we've removed that struggle for survival. So therefore, for the most part, we do not see natural selection occurring in the human population. The fourth principle is overproduction. In other words, more offspring are produced than can survive. We especially see this with things like fish, birds, spiders, insects, species that produce tons and tons of eggs and then provide very little care. Now, this principle we don't see as widely because there are species like humans, large mammals like bears, that produce 1 or 2 offspring and give them very careful care to make sure that they are raised well. But we see this sometimes with animals like dogs. There's always that runt of the litter, the one that can't necessarily get to the mom as easily, it can't compete with its siblings, can't get the food, and in nature, that animal would die. It would not be able to survive. It's the weakest. It doesn't have the best traits. The ones that are the strongest can compete with their siblings, and those are the ones that are likely to survive. Now, in dogs, we always see the runt and we say, oh, how cute, and we make sure to take care of it. But in nature, that individual wouldn't survive. And so with overproduction, so many offspring are produced that only the strongest offspring produced, the ones that don't have the beneficial traits, will not survive. And the fifth principle of natural selection is that the trait is beneficial. So if that trait is beneficial, then that individual is able to leave more offspring. It will pass on that trait to more of the offspring, and so the next generation, there are more individuals with that beneficial trait. And so as we see this happen generation after generation, we see more and more of the population with the beneficial trait and less of the population without the beneficial trait. And so therefore, this is how we see a population change overall due to natural selection. And so to bring this to evolution, evolution is the buildup of genetic changes in the population of a species over many generations. Put a star next to that. In fact, I would even encourage you to highlight the words that are bold and underlined right here, population in many generations. So evolution is the buildup of genetic changes in a population. It is the overall genetic makeup of the population changing. And so you cannot evolve. It is the change in the population as a whole. And this occurs over many generations. We can't see this occurring in our lifetime. This takes many, many generations to occur. Now, the reason evolution occurs is we see natural selection leading to small changes. Think back. We said one trait after a long period of time will show up more and more and more in the population. That small change in one trait can then build up as more and more small changes build up to lead to larger changes. That is evolution. So in other words, natural selection leads to evolution. Highlight that. Now, I want you to keep that in mind. Natural selection leads to evolution. They are not synonyms. They cannot be used interchangeably. And be aware, if you watch some of the documentaries that I recommend, they're really interesting. There's some really cool stuff there. But unfortunately, I tend to hear in documentaries a lot of times scientists use natural selection and evolution interchangeably. So listen for that and decide, when they're saying it's evolving, do they mean natural selection? Or when they say natural selection is happening, do they really mean evolution? And so listen for that and be aware that sometimes these terms are not being used accurately. So to tie this all together, natural selection leads to evolution. We can see natural selection happening in our own lifetime. In fact, when we talked about bacteria in the last chapter, we said if antibiotics are overused, we can actually kill off all of the weak, non-resistant bacteria, and the resistant bacteria has the better trait, the adaptation, which allows it to survive. And so therefore we see a population that is mostly resistant to the antibiotics. That's natural selection. We can actually see once you take away the antibiotics and you have enough time in the environment with no antibiotics, no antibacterial products, we can actually see the non-resistant bacteria is better able to compete. And so therefore the population actually reverts back to non-resistant because they have the better trait, the better ability to compete for resources over the resistant bacteria. And so that's natural selection. We can see that happening in our lifetime. Nobody argues whether natural selection occurs. People do argue whether natural selection leads to evolution, but nobody argues whether natural selection itself occurs. And the last two definitions that you may run into as you're looking at evolution. First one is microevolution. Remember, we've studied vocab. Micro means small. These are small changes in a species. This is attributed to natural selection, and a lot of times microevolution and natural selection, those terms will be used interchangeably, and those two terms are more accurately, more closely synonymous than saying evolution and natural selection. The other term is macroevolution, so evolution on a larger scale, the development of a whole new species. This term is synonymous to evolution. So I hope you feel a little bit more comfortable with the concept of evolution and natural selection. We'll get into evidence for both of those in our next section, and if you have questions, please feel free to email.